Rachel, and I'm the Director of Education at Belle Meade. I've been giving holiday tours of our historic home for over a decade, and in all this time, the thing that I think fascinates the most people is the idea of a Christmas pudding. Christmas puddings were very common in the Victorian era, but today in the United States, most Americans don't really know exactly what a Christmas pudding is. We're really familiar with the phrase a Christmas pudding or a figgy pudding because we sing about it in songs, we read about it in books, but we don't actually eat them. So most Americans are kind of confused about what exactly a Christmas pudding is. So I thought it would be fun to take a couple of minutes and tell you a little bit more about the history of Christmas puddings and give you a really easy recipe that you can make at home. So when we talk about puddings, for Americans, the idea that pops into our brains first is something along the lines of a custard, something that is the consistency of yogurt. But the word pudding actually is more closely related to the word sausage than it is the word custard. Because puddings originally, and we're talking like hundreds of years ago, back in the Middle Ages, puddings were boiled meat dishes. But puddings don't stay focused around meat. The recipe expands and evolves, and cooks in the Middle Ages began to replace the meat with breadcrumbs, keeping the fruit, keeping the spices, adding sugar to it, and that's where you get the historic ancestor of the Christmas pudding. These are sweet puddings that are being boiled and cooked and served at big festivals and events in the Middle Ages. Because they are great dishes for a party, because they have kind of a show-stopping personality, they get associated with holidays pretty quickly. And so over time, these sweet puddings become very associated with particularly the Christmas holidays in England. And this is true up until about the 1600s. In the mid-1600s, the Puritans came to power in England. Now the Puritans did not condone holidays in general, so Christmas was outlawed essentially, along with it all the traditions that had become so important to people in England, including Christmas puddings. Now, by this time in history, the Christmas pudding was a fruit-filled pudding, lots of spices, and it included a lot of alcohol as well. So while the Puritans were in power, Christmas puddings kind of faded away. But tradition tells us that when King George I came to power, he brought back all of these holidays that had been outlawed essentially by the Puritans. And traditionally, he is credited with being the king that reinstates the Christmas pudding to its place of prominence on the holiday table. Now, why Christmas puddings fell out of fashion in the United States, there's a lot of opinions about that. It might go all the way back to the American Revolution, when Americans kind of turned their noses up at anything that was British. And Christmas puddings are very British. But there were steamed puddings served in the United States through the 19th century. Most cookbooks published in this time have lots and lots of recipes for all different varieties of sweet and even savory puddings. So maybe it has more to do with the fact that once you get into the 20th century and electric ovens become more popular, more accessible, Americans sort of moved away from steaming their desserts and moved to really embracing the baked cake. So whatever the reason was, the fact is that the word pudding in the United States has kind of jumped from this steamed cake-like dish to the custards that we think of today. Whereas in England, the word pudding also made a little bit of a jump. And today the word pudding in Great Britain refers mostly to just any dessert at all. Now, if you want to make your own Victorian style Christmas pudding, there are a million different recipes on the internet for that. However, most of the traditional English Christmas pudding recipes include a lot of alcohol, so they're not super family friendly. So instead, I've pulled a recipe from a cookbook that I've had since I was a little girl. It's the Anne of Green Gables cookbook, and it was published in the late 20th century, and it was written by Kate MacDonald, who is actually Lucy Maud Montgomery's granddaughter. So this book has recipes that are inspired by the Anne of Green Gables series, and if you are a fan of this book, you will definitely remember the scene in the book where they're serving Marilla's plum pudding, and Anne realizes that she has forgotten to cover the sauce and a mouse drowned in it. So that scene in the book is hilarious, but when I was a kid, I was always confused by it because I couldn't even understand or imagine what a plum pudding was and why you would put a sauce on a pudding. Because in my mind, again, of course, I was thinking of a custard-based dessert. But the plum pudding that Marilla makes is actually a steamed, fruit-based, cake-like dessert, just like all of these other Christmas puddings that we've been talking about. So I decided to make this family-friendly recipe today to show you how easy it is to actually make a steamed Christmas pudding.
To start, you're going to need 2 mixing bowls, one that's smaller than the other. I used my nesting bowls. In the small bowl, grease it and then coat the inside with sugar. First, you're going to need 1/2 cup of raisins and 1/2 cup of currants. Now, currants are not easy to find in the United States, so I used cranberries. Now, you might be wondering, where are the plums? Well, the word plum historically, just like the word figgy in figgy pudding, refers simply to any dried fruit. Chop these up finely and then coat them with a little bit of flour, just a tablespoon or so. In another bowl, you're going to sift together 1 cup of flour, 1/2 cup of sugar, 1/2 cup of breadcrumbs, 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg, and mix all that together really well. And then you're going to add 1/2 cup of butter. Now you can mix this in with a pastry cutter or you can just use your fingers like I did. And you want it to look kind of coarse. Then you're going to add a 1/4 cup of walnuts and your floured, chopped up raisins and cranberries. And then mix all that together really well. Then you're going to add a 1/4 cup of molasses and 1 egg. Next, you need to prepare your equipment. You need a big enough pot that your small sugared bowl will fit inside it. And then you need something that will hold the bowl up off the bottom of the pan while it's cooking. So I use the insert for my Instant Pot. If you have a canning rack or even just the ring of a mason jar would work fine. Then you need a couple of pieces of foil that are big enough to cover your bowl and make sure that you grease one of them really well and put a kettle on to boil. Now you need to get a small saucepan and heat up 1/2 cup of milk. And then add that milk to your bread mixture and mix it up really well. Then you're going to pour all of that into your prepared sugared mold. Now take your foil and cover it tightly and then tie a string around it so that that foil does not move. Now I then take a tea towel and wrap my mold in the tea towel. This makes it easier to pull up out of your pan after it's done. Then you're going to put your pudding in your pan and take the boiling water that you had from earlier and very carefully pour it between the edge of the mold and the edge of the pan until you have water about halfway up your mold. Then put the lid on it and let it simmer. You're going to let this cook and steam for 3 hours. Keep an eye on it and check it from time to time because you may need to keep adding boiling water to the pot to make sure that the pudding mold is always about half covered with water.
Now for most people, the reference that they think of when they think of a Christmas pudding or a figgy pudding comes from the Christmas song, "We Wish You a Merry Christmas," which is actually a song written in the 20th century about a stereotypical rowdy Christmas caroling situation from the 17 and 1800s. Now, but one of my favorite references to Christmas pudding comes from Charles Dickens' book, A Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens describes the smell of a Christmas pudding as being a cross between an eating house, like a restaurant, a pastry cook, and a laundress. And this is because the smell of the actual dish is combining with the smell of the cloth that has been boiling down in this pot.
So carefully pull your wet pudding mold out of the pan and carefully then untie it. Now remember, it's going to be very hot. Cut the string and then pull the foil off the top.
It smells amazing. It smells like a cross between like a gingerbread and a fruit cake. You can definitely smell the raisins. You can smell the cinnamon in it. You can smell the molasses. Oh, it smells so good. Okay, so this is hot, so I would recommend that you be very careful here. I'm actually gonna.
So carefully turn out your mold onto your serving dish. And use something to protect your hands because these bowls are really hot when they've just come out of this boiling water. And now it's time to make the sauce. So in a small saucepan, take a 1/2 cup of brown sugar, 1.5 tablespoons of flour and a pinch of salt, and add 1 cup of boiling water to this. Now you're going to mix this all together over low heat. Now the recipe says it should only take about 5 minutes, but for me it took about 15. What you're looking for is for this sauce to no longer look watery, but to be thick and a dark caramel color. Once it's ready, take it off the heat and you're gonna add 1 tablespoon of butter and 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. Now once you've got it all mixed up, you're ready to pour your sauce on your pudding. But make sure you save a little sauce back because you wanna serve sauce with the pudding to your guests. It's better to have a little extra sauce on each slice. I hope this recipe has inspired you to add some new and maybe some old traditions to your holidays this year.